Check, check. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. May I request all of you to kindly take your seats and turn your cell phones on silent mode. We're about to begin in 10 seconds from now. I would request everyone standing to please take your seats and requesting all of you to please turn your cell phones to silent mode. Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, it gives me a great pleasure to welcome you all to GAFX 2025. Please take a moment and give up a big round of applause for yourself. Thank you so much, everyone, for being right here. We have an exciting lineup of sessions today, from deep dives into gaming technology and AI to unlocking investment opportunities to career guidance in the industry. Ladies and gentlemen, we kick off today's session with a special deep dive into the most acclaimed gaming franchise of our time, that is Marvel's Spider-Man. The magic of procedural system plays an actual and crucial role in bringing its breathtaking open-world gameplay to life. And today, we get an inside look at the technology behind it. Are you all excited for it? Oh, come on. This is a dream session that you could have asked for. The energy should be really up high right there. Are you all excited for it? Amazing. This is the energy we were looking at. Here to take us through this fascinating world is none other than X-Ray Halperin. He is Senior Technical Artist at Insomniac Games Sony. Ladies and gentlemen, before I invite him on the stage, it's very important that I take you all through his incredible piece of work. Ladies and gentlemen, X-Ray Halperin is a game developer and visual effects supervisor whose career spans video games, feature film, advertising, and location-based entertainment. X-Ray currently works at Insomniac Games, developing procedural techniques for open-world games. Not just that, it including Marvel Spider-Man, Marvel Spider-Man Miles Morales, Marvel Spider-Man 2, and Ratchet and Clank Rift Apart. Before joining Insomniac Games, X-Ray drone passengers of Titanic add veins to Brad Pitt's face during his interview with Vampire. Help the Fall Guy track down the kidnappers, attempt to kill John Connor in Terminator 2 3D Battle Across Time. Not just that, crash planes on Fight Club and hit Brotherhood of Mutants with Optic Force Blast on X-Men 2, X-Men United. Don't you think so? It calls for a big round of applause. We all have been in awe with the work that we have seen. It doesn't end right there. I have a few more lines to let you all know about X-Ray. Was the colorist for the digital film Cannes Apollo 13, led the crowd animation team on B-Movie, and worked on visual effects of the climate battle between Po and Tai Lung on Kung Fu Panda. He built the crowd animation pipeline for Image Movers Digital and supervised the crowd animation for film's Disney campaign to List, and is also a member of SIGGRAPH, a distinguished speaker program. X-Ray frequently presents at conferences all over the world, such as GDC 2024, GDC 2025, EPC 2024, SIGGRAPH Asia 2009, SIGGRAPH Asia 2018, SIGGRAPH Asia 2021. And believe me, I can just go on and on and on about his incredible achievements. Without further ado, ladies and gentlemen, please put your hands together for the one and only X-Ray Halperin on the stage.
Hi. So before I start, I want to get a selfie because you're such a great looking audience. This is awesome. So everybody smile. Oops, wrong mode. Yeah. Technical difficulties. Come on. All right, 1, 2, 3. Okay, everybody make a funny face. Do something weird. 1, 2, 3. All right. So thanks for joining me today. You probably heard my name is X-Ray Halperin. I'm a technical artist at Insomniac Games. And I've been working on the Spider-Man franchise for at least 3 games now. Marvel Spider-Man, Marvel Spider-Man Miles Morales, and Marvel's Spider-Man 2. A lot of people like to take pictures of all the slides, but instead of that, you could just use this QR code and you can just download them. There's a PDF file of all the slides, so you can actually pay attention during my talk, and you don't have to, keep snapping pictures. I'll give you a couple minutes to get this and make sure the link is working. I see a lot of phones up, so I'm just going to wait until I don't see any more phones. Okay, I still see a couple. All right, I think going once, going twice, going 3 times. All right. So, what is the Insomniac approach to technical art? At Insomniac Games, we have a completely proprietary technical stack. We've got our own engine, the Insomniac engine. We've got our own asset editors. We've got our own scripting language. We're not using any off-the-shelf game engine technology. But we do use various digital creation content tools in order to build models and textures and stuff that we then feed into our game engine. I tend to work a lot on building tools for creating open worlds. So when I say procedural tools, it's not a runtime procedural. This is often using a digital content creation package that supports procedural techniques and scripting in order to do something that computers happen to be really good at, which is repetitive work. Python and Houdini are my primary frameworks for creating procedural tools. When I joined Insomniac, there were 2 technical artists working with procedural systems. On the first Spider-Man game, me and one other guy, David Santiago. By the time we started to do Marvel's Miles Morales, we added a few more people. And by the time we got around to Spider-Man 2, you can see that there were probably about 20 power users of Houdini contributing to the procedural tools of the game development. So a lot of the procedural art for Marvel's Spider-Man was for the open world. The architecture of our games kind of informs how we approach it. And the Spider-Man games are considered streaming games. And I don't mean like Netflix streaming. What I mean is we're constantly loading data off of the hard drive or now the SSD on the PlayStation 5. We're constantly loading data and unloading data so that the high-res content, whatever happens to be around the player, is loaded off disk. Whatever's in the distance is represented by a low-resolution proxy. And we are constantly loading and unloading or streaming data off the disk. So when I talk about a streaming game, that's what I'm talking about. So our open world is divided into these streaming regions that we refer to as tiles. We're making Marvel's New York, so we grid up the entire city into 128-meter square tiles. Each tile is 128 meters, and what we're doing is we're loading in the 128 meters around the player. We're also loading in the surrounding tiles around that tile, so it's a total of 9 tiles at any given time that's getting streamed off the disk. Everything beyond those 9 tiles is a low-resolution proxy. You can see here, this is what it looks like. We actually have the high-res stuff. This is what the game looks like. You could see off into the distance. You could see the skyline pretty much out to the horizon. Looks pretty good. And here I've turned off the imposter system. So you can actually see the high-resolution area that surrounds the player, and everything else out to the horizon that would be replaced with a low-resolution proxy is absent, and you can see the high-res stuff streaming in off of the disk. You see a bunch of stuff floating out there. There's some other systems that handle things that are important to building silhouettes at the distance, things like antennas, air conditioning units, stuff like that. So what is a streaming region? Well, a streaming region is represented by JSON. It's a human-readable file format, and you can see here that we're talking about a tile called tile M35. All the tiles have a letter and a number designation, a coordinate. So tile M35's got an art zone, a gameplay zone, a lighting zone, a ground zone, which actually contains the art. There's various data, visual effects, and so forth. So how do we work with game data like that in a digital content creation engine, or digital content creation package such as Houdini? Well, we use point clouds because the JSON, in addition to representing the zone that I showed you, also represents all the contents of the zone. So let's have a look at tile M35. We look at the JSON data that the game engine has and the level editor has to represent that tile. And we can load it into Houdini as a point cloud. Each of the points here represents a model instance. It's the pivot point of an individual model. Each point has attributes that can tell us what model to load, where it is in space, what's the transform, etc., and so forth. By reading that geometry off of the disk based on the point cloud, I can reconstruct all of the geometry for that streaming region, in this case tile M35, in a digital content creation package such as Houdini. So let's talk about the first Spider-Man game, Marvel's Spider-Man, and open world authoring. We might start out by creating a gray box that represents Marvel's Manhattan. This could be read from something like OpenStreetMaps, taking a little bit of liberty, of course, but we might start with OpenStreetMaps, which is a open source GPS file format that tells you like where the buildings are, rough footprints and stuff like that. We can read that into Houdini, and we can extrude a very rough version of the city. From there, artists will come in and sort of start to sculpt the gray boxes. So as they sculpt the gray boxes, they make things look a little more realistic, make them look like, the first floor, the second floor, the 10th floor of a building, creating in-cuts and out-cuts and more interesting shapes than just a bunch of extruded boxes. Once we have the shapes, we can then instance models around them using a building kit. So windows, walls, doors, things like that. So by reading in that volume, that gray box, dividing it up, and keeping things structured according to certain metrics like 2 meters, 4 meters, 6 meters, we can decide where windows, walls, and doors go. And by dividing the city up into neighborhoods, we can control things like what style of building it is. Is it a glass tower? Is it a brick building? Is it a brownstone? In addition to that, we also create a markup language. So a lot like on a web page, a 2D web page where you've got HTML, and you might define a region where if the mouse moves over that region, it creates some effect, or the text inverts or flashes or something like that. We do a very similar thing, except we're doing it in 3D space using curves. So we create curves on the geometry. Again, some of these curves are part of the model instances, some of them go through procedural systems, and in this case, these green lines represent perch points for Spider-Man when he gets close to the edge of a building and he knows where to perch, right? So it's a navigation clue that tells the character how to react when the player moves toward the edge of a rooftop. Here's what the open world for Marvel's Spider-Man looked like. It was about 6 kilometers by 3 kilometers. There's thousands of buildings, lots of cool stuff going on. How do we build that? Well, I showed you an image earlier that showed the island of Manhattan divided up into tiles. So we start out with the island outline. Then we define roads and alleys. Now, there's an interesting thing about roads and alleys, an anecdote that I'll share with you. When you think about superhero movies and superhero stories and superhero television shows, there's always crimes and games, superhero games. There's always crimes. The superhero's always stopping crimes. You think about, where do those crimes happen? Can somebody think, where do a lot of crimes happen? Alleys, that's right. New York is full of alleys in games. Real New York has about 4 alleys in it. Real estate is way too valuable in New York City to have alleys. But for the fantasy of the game, we need to make hundreds of alleys in New York City so that Spider-Man has some place to stop crimes. So from starting by defining our roads and alleys, we then create ground modifiers. Ground modifiers are volumes that we can place in the space that do things like cut holes in the ground. You can see there's a big area there which is Central Park. It should be there it is. It's hard to read. There's Central Park right there. And then from there, we use all that data to generate the ground and the terrain for the game. So this is the flat ground with the sidewalks and the roads and the curbs and all of those elements that contribute to the game. And this is all procedurally generated by starting with the outline, getting these roads which have attributes on them that define what kind of road it is, how big it is, and stuff like that. We read that into Houdini. We modify, cut holes, and stuff like that. And on the output, we get our terrain, our blocks and blocks of terrain. So what do these bits of terrain look like? This is a single streaming tile. And what you can see is the ground is cut into 16 pieces. And if you look on the lower portion that's in bright blue, you can actually see the 16 models. And why would we divide that into 16 regions? Well, this represents 128 meters, of course. But we also want to be able to create levels of detail across that 128 meters. We don't want the whole ground to just pop when the level of detail changes. So by cutting each 128 meter tile into 16 meter chunks, we can control the level of detail a lot better. It's also a lot friendlier for systems like physics and things like that. For Marvel's Spider-Man 2, we added the neighborhoods of Brooklyn and Queens. So the city size roughly doubled. And here you can see the street map for Brooklyn and Queens next to the street map of Manhattan. These systems were also used for audio. So around the edge of Manhattan, there's water, and we needed to define the audio blend that goes between water and land, right? The tone of the audio is going to be different if you're over water, if you're over land, or if you're right at the shore. So we could create, just like I showed you the ledge path markup for where Spider-Man can perch, for audio, we create a volume. It's really just a box that defines an area. We call them volumes. And that will define where the echo and reverb is going to happen. And again, we procedurally generate these volumes and then pass them to the audio team to use in their audio processing. In addition to creating the audio volumes around the edge of the island, we also create audio volumes in all the city blocks. Because when you're in a canyon of tall buildings, there's echo. And depending on the height of the buildings, the echo might be a little bit different. So in order to do something like this, I'll ask the audio team, hey, I know you want to have these audio volumes, but I don't know any. I'm a technical artist. I don't really know audio. Can you just build some of it? Just give me an example. Just build a little bit of it. So it took like 2 or 3 days to do one small area by hand placing all of these audio volumes. But once they did that, it created a reference for me to go in, measure the whole city, and place audio volumes everywhere using a procedural system. It took me a couple of weeks to code this up, but once that was done, a single click of a button would regenerate the whole thing. So if the city were to change, if they moved buildings around or something like that, I could regenerate all of the audio volumes and pass them off to the audio team. Here's another view, a little bit more 3D, just showing all of the audio volumes that are placed in the city. And again, this is using that same curve network that generated the city itself, right? So starting with that curve network, we can build system on system on system procedurally across the game. Another view, top down, see the two sets of audio volumes, the one that represents the interface between the water and the land, plus the volumes in the city. This is the audio volume setup for Spider-Man 2. We made some improvements. It got a little bit more intricate. You can practically see the city here. Every single one of these volumes is not a building, but it's actually the street, but it represents the height of the buildings around that street. We use volumes for other things besides audio. If you've played the games, you'll see that there's pedestrians walking everywhere. So we have to define, well, where do pedestrians spawn into the game? Again, we use volumes to define the areas on the sidewalks and such where pedestrians are likely to spawn into the game. Parked cars is another one. If you played the game, you'll see there's parked cars all over the streets. And, if you can imagine being a junior artist, you come into a big studio, it's your first job, you're very excited, and they ask you to do something like place parked cars for the next 6 months. That's your job. I don't know about you, but I think that's kind of a waste of artistic talent. So using a procedural system based on these same principles, we can place these volumes all over the city that are defined as car spawners, right? We can just spawn the cars into these volumes, and we could take that artist and give them a much more artistic job. And the same thing with long-range pedestrians. Long-range pedestrians are the pedestrians that are at a distance. They're not the full-quality pedestrians that you see close up. And here's an overlay that shows all 3 volumes, pedestrians, parking, and pedestrian long-range volumes. We also use the same procedural base to define rules for traffic. So it's bustling. It's Marvel's New York City. There's traffic everywhere. So we can define the rules for how traffic works, and we can define the phases of the traffic lights that control the pedestrians and the vehicles, how they start and stop, how people cross the street, things like that. This is an example of an intersection. This is the markup. Again, it's similar to that ledge markup that I mentioned earlier. We have a certain type of markup that we derive through procedural systems and rules that defines the different actions and phases that can occur when traffic enters an intersection. Here's a slightly pulled back view showing some more of those traffic intersections and how the phases interact with each other. Another system involving streets was street signs. So if you play the game, you'll notice that there are, in fact, street signs on every street, and the streets all have names. And, they're relatively accurate to real New York City, although we take some artistic license. This is Marvel's New York City. So, but again, rather than having an artist go in and place these thousands of textures manually, what we do is create a procedural system that reads that curve network, and each of those curves has an attribute on it that's the street name. And by looking at the cross product and the dot product of the sign, we can determine which sign is parallel to the street, which sign is perpendicular to the street, get those street names, and assign the correct texture. In fact, we can actually build the textures. So an artist never built these textures. I used Houdini to grab all of the street names used a font sop and some compositing magic to create a texture. And then I look up the street name based on the geometry and apply an override onto the traffic signal with its 90-degree street signs to place those street signs. This is a look at the Insomniac asset vault, filtering for the street signs. So these are the street sign textures that were procedurally generated. Here's a template street sign, and you can see that, it's a model, it's got textures on it, but the street signs are actually blanks. There's no text on those street signs. The street signs themselves, these light posts, are procedurally placed in New York City also. So according to various heuristics and rules, we could say every corner is going to have a traffic signal and a street light. And then once it gets into the game context and I've created the overrides for the textures, this is what it might look like. And, this just goes on over and over again throughout the entire city, a few thousand times. Again, computers are really good at the repetitive stuff that, if we tried to assign it to an artist would be, quite honestly, kind of boring. And nobody wants to do that. So what does that look like in code? Well, this is the asset definition for that lamppost. So here we see that we're creating an override for street name A and street name B. In this case, where the override is Park Avenue and Kingston. Is that the same? Yeah, Park Avenue and Kingston. So by creating an override for the same asset, so it's the same basic lamppost asset getting repeated everywhere, but by creating an override on each instance of that asset, we can define unique street names and make the city feel that much more realistic. Earlier, I showed you a video where I turned off the low-res proxy buildings that are in the distance. Those low-res proxy buildings are called imposters. Imposters have been around for a while. They were described by a couple of researchers named Messier and Shirley in 1995 in some SIGGRAPH papers that were published. They defined two different kinds of imposters, view-dependent and view-independent. Both of these techniques have been used in a lot of games, but they just did not have the visual fidelity that we needed for the Marvel Spider-Man games. They defined a way to capture textures from an asset, but this is pretty limited. If you try to create some kind of high-quality capture using a hemisphere, you're going to get a lot of textures. We don't really want to do that. There's too many textures. We don't want a flat thing, because those billboard textures like you see in old video games, I mean, they're fun, they're awesome, I love old video games, but we're trying to go for a higher level of fidelity. So we came up with the IG imposter system, which maintains fidelity across all the circumstances. There's no clipping planes. We actually keep a certain amount of geometric relief detail, and we support emission and reflectance, and we try to transition them as seamlessly as possible from the high-res assets that are streaming off the disk into these low-res assets that are always in global resident memory out to the horizon. So what do we do? I mentioned earlier when I showed you the point cloud that we create these buildings using lots of model instances. So this is a building. There are 55,000 model instances in this building. Windows, walls, doors, etc. In order to create the imposter, we want to turn these model instances into a single mesh and then reduce that mesh down to something reasonable. So we've gone from 55,000 model instances and 92,000 polys to a single model instance with about 5,000 polys. The building in the middle here is the high-res asset, and the one on the left is the imposter. I think that's a pretty reasonable look. You'll notice that the imposter's lacking air conditioning units and the antenna that are actually pretty important to the silhouette of the building. And if you recall in that video, you saw some stuff floating out there that I said was like antennas and air conditioning units, and those all contribute to the silhouette. That's handled by a separate system where we kind of identify the models that are really important to breaking up the silhouettes, and those get drawn out to a farther distance. And in this image, you can pretty much see New York City all the way out to the horizon, but this is all imposters. These are all the imposters. And at this distance, I mean, you can't really tell. It looks pretty good. And this is another view from Spider-Man 2. So this is the Spider-Man remaster. And then this is a rework of the game for Spider-Man 2. Another view, just so you could see how it reacts to different lighting effects. I think it looks pretty good for a lot of low-res assets. And all of these assets, I want to stress, they reside in global resident memory on the PlayStation 5, a console, and I believe the total memory footprint for the geometry is about 200 megabytes for all of New York City. And the lowest MIP of the texture is about a gigabyte. So we have all of New York City in memory in just over a gigabyte. And that means that we can draw New York City out to the horizon. We don't have to have fog. We don't get clipping planes. We don't have like near-far clipping planes. It just kind of works. And we transition from the high-res assets to the low-res assets. In addition, the imposter system is used for ray tracing. So when you see a ray traced reflection, that's the imposters you see in the reflection. One of my cohorts, Scott Kircher, did a very deep dive on this imposter system at GDC 2024. And if you have access to the GDC Vault, I would encourage you to go back and find that if you're really intensely curious about more technical details on the IG imposter system. I talked about crimes that happen in alleys. Well, we got to put them there, right? And again, rather than having artists hand place where all the crimes happen, we created a procedural system to place these crime vignettes. So an artist might create a vignette that represents a burglary or a drug deal or something like that, and then we can place these vignettes around the city. This is a Houdini digital asset that has some controls that define how we place them. And then based on some various rules, in this case, this is a distribution with some simple placement rules. They need to be about 150 meters apart, and we always want them on opposite sides of the street, right? So these don't all pop into the game at once, but as you're playing the game, a crime might happen here, a crime might happen there. So this is what a vignette might look like. An artist might place some cars and some people spawned in, and then we'll take that and procedurally place it according to these simple rules and heuristics. This is what it looks like in context. And we might do another procedural thing, which is we could check the bounding boxes of all of these models and assets against the environment, and we can look for penetrations and intersections, and when we find them, we can actually flag them, and then we can bring in artists to like nudge things around and fix the individual instances. So it really is about allowing the artist to do the important stuff and letting the computer do the boring, repetitive stuff. And again, this is what the final vignette might look like in the game. So it's a fairly seamless thing at the end of the day, but there's a process to it. And another view of the same vignette. This is some kind of a crime that's happening. You can see the perpetrators are down on the ground there. The cops are doing their thing. I have a whole section on light grids and light probes that's not in this particular talk because I covered that in a GDC talk that I did in 2019. If you're interested in procedural lighting, again, I will refer you to the 2019 GDC talk. I think it might even be on YouTube at this point for free. But I'm going to talk about it briefly. So we have global illumination in Spider-Man. We have bounce light, right? If Spider-Man is standing next to a red brick building, you'll see the red reflected global illumination bounce light on him. So how do we do that? Well, with light probes are actually going to be, okay, I don't want to confuse light probes and light grids. Light probes are for the reflectance. So think of it like a chrome ball. So on Marvel's Spider-Man, we would put about 4 of these chrome balls into a 128 tile so that wherever you are, you find the nearest chrome ball and that becomes your rendered reflection. For Spider-Man 2, we increased it quite a bit. What is the actual number? So we went from a 2x2 grid of 4 to a 3x3 grid of 9. And it's kind of hard to see in the slide, but there's these little red dots in here. So each of those is the location of a light probe. So Spider-Man 1 was a very sparse light probe, and Spider-Man 2, we increased the density of the light probes to increase the quality of the fidelity of the game. Puddles. Does anybody remember Puddlegate from Spider-Man 1? No? Well, we released some images from Spider-Man 1 very early on. They had puddles in them. And then when the game came out, there were less puddles, and people thought we were somehow they were paying for puddles, and we weren't giving them the puddles they were paying for. And it became kind of a controversy and a meme on the internet. So I can't really talk about Spider-Man without talking about puddles. And so later in the game, when we released a photo pack, we actually added stickers so that players could place their own puddles into the game. So here's a look at the qualitative difference between the puddles on Marvel's Spider-Man versus Marvel's Spider-Man 2. On Marvel's Spider-Man, the puddles were controlled by vertex colors, so painted vertex colors on the ground geometry. In Spider-Man 2, they were controlled by a completely new system that we developed. There's a higher level system that was actually in the material and did not rely on vertex colors. So, that was Marvel's Spider-Man. A little bit about Spider-Man 2. Let's talk about Marvel's Spider-Man Miles Morales. So it was a slightly larger game. We added a few more tiles. We went from 720 streaming tiles to 735 streaming tiles. We completely reskinned the city. It's basically the same city, but we went from fall to winter. So rather than having artists go in, do all of this stuff, we came up with some systems to pull out all the fall decorations and put in all the winter decorations, cover the ground with snow, put snow mounds and little bits of snow at the interface of the buildings. And you can see here, this is what it looked like. The snow piles up on the curb are built to certain metrics. Let's have a look at our friend M35. M35 happens to be my favorite tile in the game. Can anybody tell me why? Anybody have a guess why? Yes. Doctor Strange lives there, yes. I like Doctor Strange. Doctor Strange lives in tile M35. This is Doctor Strange's Sanctum Sanctorum. It's the tile that I use for all my tests because I like looking at it. Anyway, getting back to the snow. This is the Insomniac Asset Vault. The snow mounds are built on metrics, so 2, 4, 6, 8 meters. And by analyzing, doing some geometric analyzing of the terrain, I can pull out some curves that represent where the curbs actually are. I can trim back the intersections for the disabled access ramps and driveways, and then instance those models onto those curves. and do the same things for the buildings themselves. So we want to have a little snow skirt around the edges of the buildings. I can add the snow skirt in. And there's our skinned, snowy Manhattan in winter, Dr. Strange's tile M35. For Spider-Man 2, spoiler alert, there's a fight against Sandman. So we did a very similar thing with sand. So this is the asset vault for sand skirts and things like that, using a very similar system, placing sand where it needs to go, and that's how we did sand. On Miles Morales and Spider-Man, we used vertex paint to control various aspects of the intersections. On Miles Morales, this was super important because we had directional snow on the streets, and then in the intersections, we sort of have an omnidirectional texture. So by using vertex colors on the geometry, we can control directionality. So on the left here is Houdini with the paint sop. So an artist can paint into an intersection, then hit the save button, and on the left, it's going to build, and you can actually see that texture now it's directional. Now, by erasing that, the intersection will become omnidirectional. So red represents road directionality, black represents omnidirectional textures, and we can control the blending between the directional and the omnidirectional textures on the roads. Now, this is handled procedurally, but every once in a while there might be a problematic intersection that an artist needs to go in and fix. So this was a little system that I wrote to allow an artist to load it into Houdini, make a few paint fixes, and then save it out. It gets sucked up into the level editor, and you can actually see it get built in real time. Holiday decorations, very similar to the snow and the sand. These are window lights, like Christmas lights around a window. We identify like a certain number of windows to get these assets placed. Navigation clues. So Miles Morales introduced a tech-powered enemy called the Underground. The Underground had these super jump abilities where they could kind of jump from rooftop to rooftop, but they have to know, like, where are the rooftops? Where is it legal to jump? This is what the Underground looked like. This was sort of an artistic rendering of, how they might jump. So this is a Houdini network that analyzes the city and generates clues for how the Underground can jump and navigate. So looking again at tile M35, my favorite tile in the game, we can isolate things like rooftop edges and ledges where they might jump from, isolate the actual roof, generate potential navigation clues, and then whittle them down by things like, okay, well, we don't want them too close. If there's too many going in one place, we'll delete them out, just analyzing them, coming up with a best set based on our heuristics, and then repeat it for the entire city procedurally. This is what tile M35 might look like. You'll see that they kind of look like they're going through the buildings. That's because we would do a straight line, but then we would put a helper box kind of halfway up that allowed it to arc through the air. In Houdini, we created a spline to model tool. So this is something where an artist could define a curve in our level editor and then instance trees or other things around it. And some pedestrians who seem to have lost their heads. This was also used for creating freeway curve entrances, exits, things like that. On Spider-Man 2, we improved the system a little bit. The freeways, again, merging procedural systems, spline to model, the traffic rules, all of these different systems kind of coming together at runtime in the game engine to inform how our city looks, lives, and breathes. So, Marvel Spider-Man, 720 tiles. Marvel Spider-Man Miles Morales, 735 tiles. Marvel Spider-Man 2, 1,794 tiles. Much bigger game. We also have persistent environmental effects in Spider-Man 2, which did not exist in Marvel's Spider-Man or Miles Morales. So, for example, there's the big Sandman fight, buildings get destroyed, and that damage becomes persistent. In fact, what you can see here is what we call a load hint with an override. So at the bottom, you can see 3 different world states. There's a sand heavy, sand medium, and sand light. So we actually wanted to show that the city was a living city. In the aftermath of the Sandman fight, there's a lot of damage, and then a little bit later, they're rebuilding. You start to see like construction fencing go up. So it's like as if the city was destroyed and it's getting rebuilt slowly over the course of the game. Here you can see the world state enums in the lower right, and by toggling on the different world states, you can see there's the sand heavy, sand medium, and sand light effects. So the completely destroyed building, then a building that has some fencing built up around it. You can see the rubble at the bottom is changing based on that world state as well. And that helps just create a more living and dynamic world. We do the same thing with the Venom goo, these goo tendrils that were the main character Venom is growing around the city. These are also controlled by a series of persistent world state load hints. This is a test of the symbiote environment work, and you can see that we're doing some high resolution work in the foreground, and in the background we're also trying to figure out how to imposter it. This is what it looked like in the game. And we also introduced a technology called color volumes in Marvel's Spider-Man 2. So I don't want to confuse by saying volume. In this case, it's not like a voxel grid. We're not talking about voxelized volumes here. We're just talking about, it's a type of decal, and we're using a box, a volume, that represents, because it's handy to have an orientation, a position, and a scale. And a box, a bounding box, has orientation, position, scale, all of these attributes that we can apply to a decal projection. So on Marvel's Miles Morales and Marvel's Spider-Man, we would have done this with vertex paint. We wanted to eliminate vertex paint and use these color volumes, because as things LOD, if you have vertex colors, the vertex colors will pop. And we want to avoid that vertex color pop. So by having a persistent volume or a bounding box around a building with a series of utility textures, we can avoid any sort of vertex color based popping. These color volumes are used for grime maps, streak maps, wetness maps, all sorts of stuff. They've got a lot, they're pretty low resolution, and the way that they worked was they were not a direct texture like you'd think an RGB decal, but these are utility textures that are used to drive parameters in a shader. So there might be a high resolution, grime texture and the high resolution brick texture, and we use the color volume to generate a mask for blending between those textures. Here's an example, just a quick example of a brick wall. This is the material graph that shows the color volume node controlling the mix between 2 different textures. This might represent the color volume, the projection that's being used as a mask. And then in the game, it could look something like that, where you're modulating and mixing 2 high-resolution textures using a sort of a decal-type projection, but it's not a decal. It's being controlled by a bounding box that has an orientation and a scale, so you can create a bounding box around a building. You can actually create 5 of them, so you've got, projections going in different directions. Buildings tend to be kind of boxy, so it's nice. This is what one of the grime textures might look like, kind of a red streaky texture. This is what the projections would look like when they're projected onto a building. So, these are controlling weather, grime, dirt, wetness, things like that. We have an asset tagging system. I'm not going to really go into too much detail on that. We're running a little bit short on time, but suffice it to say, we can analyze our model instances and then create asset tags that are appropriate for searching in our vault. And then using those asset tags, we can do things like swap models for models, right? We could say, okay, this is a window at a certain metric and in a certain style. And I could say, take the brownstone style and turn it into a brick style. So in that way, once a building has been constructed, we can kind of create a modified version of that building so things don't look quite as repetitive. We wanted to plus up the webs when we moved from the PlayStation 4 to the PlayStation 5. So this is kind of what the web attachment points look like for Marvel's Spider-Man. We engaged in a sort of a look development process to define procedural tools and make digital assets to control the various types of webs that we might want. So this is a video showing in Houdini how these tools might work. You just use a particle system, trail the particle system, create the curves, sweep some geometry along it, create some attachment points by then taking the endpoints of those curves using another particle system and creating some nice like gecko kind of feelers on the end. Put a little web knot down at the base, and there we go. This is some more look exploration using those tools. One of them was a knot tool. We wanted, if you look at Spider-Man's webs, it's got these nice knots on it. We wanted to plus up the knots, so we created a digital asset that allowed the artists to control the shape of the knots on the web. So starting with a spiral, adjusting some curves to control the diameter of the spiral at different points. Merging a few different curves together, and you come up with some cool-looking comic book Spider-Man classic web knots. This was then also used for in Spider-Man 2, we introduced the ability to create these stealth web lines that Spider-Man could crawl around on. And so you could see that the knots and the web attachment points were all used in that system as well. We like to leverage these things as much as possible. Here's some beauty shots from the game that kind of showcase the knots. There they are. And thank you. I'd like to... obviously, I don't do all of this alone. We've got a big team, a lot of people involved in all of these systems. I'm just going to give a shout out to the people whose work I've referenced in this presentation. Sean Applegate, Matthew Bennett, Abdul Bezradi, Matthew Bullister, Cullen Carnes, Harrison Eilers, Mike Fitzgerald, Al Hastings, Phil Hunter, Ashley Jennings, Jeraine Jackson, Scott Kircher, Paul Martin, Jake Parmley, Alon Ruskin, David Santiago, Steven Skidmore, and Jay Twasson. Now it's time for Q&A, and while we do the Q&A, I'm going to leave up these fun facts about Marvel's Spider-Man. Now, whoever asks me a question can come up and get the first pick of any of the game swag that I've got here up on the stage. So, Q&A time. I don't know if we got a microphone to pass around or if you just got a nice booming voice.
So here's a great chance. So you get to ask a question. You don't get this kind of opportunity. So make the most. Put your hands up. We shall pass the mic to you and then you can ask your question.
Hello. Yeah, I just wanted to ask you that how do you avoid repetitions and overlaps between organic shapes? So you talked about snow and sand, right? So when you place them side by side, sometimes they cross what you wanted to know. So
Yeah.
how do you avoid that?
Well, it's perfectly okay for them to intersect. They're modeled in a way that if they do intersect, it's a seamless, they're kind of blobby organic shapes, right? So if there's a little bit of penetration between them, it's fine. But what you'll notice is that when I showed the vault image, they were built on various metrics. So 2 metrics, 4 metrics, 2 meters, 4 meters, 8 meters, 16 meters. So when I'm generating those lines, right, what I'm going to do is I'm going to divide those lines into 2 meter, 4, I'm going to take the longest segment I can find, right? So if there's a 16 meter straight line, that's going to get the 16 meter piece. And then if that 16 meter line is really an 18 meter line, it'll get a 16 and a 2 on it. So, there's some analytical geometry that has to happen in order to do that. But, it turned out it just kind of worked. It wasn't really, if you really were to look at it, I guess maybe you'd see the repetition. But hopefully there's enough other things happening in the game that's not the thing that maybe catches your eye. And it's just white snow. So there's not a lot of detail, and there's not a lot of unique silhouette type of things that it doesn't really catch your eye. I see a hand over here. Or I'll let
Am I audible? Hi. Hi, Akshay. Right here. Orange hat.
Hi.
Lovely session, by the way. I just wanted to quickly make sense of... you mentioned that you help make the workflow of the artist a lot more easier so that the artist can focus on the creative bit. I'm trying to make sense of what sort of feedback you expect from the artist to build tools like this.
Okay. Well, first of all, sir, please come up and take something. So generally, it's a partnership, right? I'm not working on this stuff in a vacuum. I'm working at a company that's 400 people. There's an environment art team, and an environment artist maybe has an idea like, hey, we need to, we need to build the snow. Let's take the snow as an example, right? So I'll work with an artist to create those assets, those modeled assets. Those are hand-created assets. And then I'll run it through a system, like I showed you with the curves and placing it around. And if it doesn't work, if it looks wrong or weird or like the gentleman here was saying, like, how do you know, right? Well, we're humans. We're artistic humans. Even though I'm technical, I'm a little bit artistic. And so, we get together, we examine it, we look at it, we try to find where it's working, where it's not working, and we make adjustments and we iterate along the way. It's a lot about communication, it's about teamwork, and when developing a procedural system, it's really important to have a partnership with a stakeholder, right? Somebody who's responsible for the ultimate art of it, not just the technical side. I hope that answers your question. Please come up and take some swag.
Yeah, hi, Akshat. Yeah, so there's a rare times when the player or the character is moving through the map, and there's a certain intersection, and you just drop through the map. So does that happen in real-time rendering, or it's something related to procedural systems?
I would say it's a little of both. So the procedural systems often define how the runtime navigation and collision gets generated. So if there's a mistake in the procedural content, then that mistake will ripple through the collision detection system. Obviously, it's not our intent to do stuff like that, but players are excellent at finding that stuff. So it's a mix of the two. It's one system informing another system. So, yeah, come up and grab a goodie.
Hello, over here.
Hi.
Thank you for the talk. I've also seen Horizon's procedural placement system. I thought that was really awesome.
Yeah, those guys are awesome.
And watching your presentation today really expanded like how many different ways there are to use procedural systems. I also wanted to ask for the vignettes. You said that the vignettes are artist authored, but you placed them. Have you also worked on some procedural creation of the vignettes themselves?
We haven't.
Okay, sorry.
It's okay. I mean, it's a natural question to ask. There's a lot of art direction that goes into those vignettes, right? They're very art directed, and so sometimes the fastest way to get a result, if they really want to have artistic direction be a really important part of the storytelling, right? Because these vignettes are kind of about storytelling. And the writer, there might be lines of dialogue in them, and there might be, the police telling the criminals, how to hit the ground, come on, and there might be all sorts of other things involved in that that are really in the purview of, think about it like a film director directing a scene, right? And we want to capture that emotion. And it's not to say that we couldn't maybe come up with a system to plop a few cars in and put some cops and robbers into a scene. I mean, we probably could. But I think that sometimes when you have a human actually do some of that stuff, it can be of a higher quality.
That makes sense. Thank you.
Yeah, please, if you feel like it, come on down and
Yes.
have some swag.
Here. Yeah, good afternoon. Over here. Left. Your left.
Oh, yes, okay.
Yeah. So first of all, this is a lovely presentation, and I had one question was that you didn't mention the snow effect on the buildings and on the roads, but how does the snow affect on the automobiles and all the stuff around it?
So in the case of so not all of the snow was procedural. In the case of certain props and the cars, that might have gone to our environment team, and they arted it up. It's not to say that there wasn't any proceduralism in that, because I think one of our environment artists actually, he knew enough Houdini to be able to, for example, get the surface normal of a model, find the points that are pointing up, and then pile, some snow instances on it, or change an override for a texture to create a more snowy look on the car. I'm not sure how many cars there are in the game, but I think one thing that's important when you look at procedural systems is that there's a certain commitment of time and energy to build a procedural system. It might take me 2 weeks, 3 weeks, 4 weeks sometimes to build a system, right? So the time that we save has to be longer than that. If an artist can do 10 cars in a week, then it doesn't make sense for me to take 3 weeks to build a procedural system to handle adding snow to cars. So there's kind of a give and take there. And this comes back to communication, right? Working with an artist, scoping each task out, looking at it, really analyzing it and going like, all right, there's a phrase we use sometimes like, is the juice worth the squeeze? Is it worth it for me to spend 3 weeks to create a system that's going to add snow to cars if we can get a couple of artists that can take care of all of the cars in a week? Sometimes the answer is yes, sometimes it's no. A lot of times it comes down to the scale of it. If we had to do 1,000 cars, then a procedural system would totally be the way to go. But, I think we've got like a sedan, a station wagon, a police car. There's probably about 10 basic types of cars in the game, and we were able to do those by hand faster than I could develop a procedural system to handle that task.
And follow-up question is you told the game 460 MB was the total storage of New York, right? The whole map. What are the challenges you faced to reduce the size of the whole city?
Right. So the city in Marvel Spider-Man was about 4 kilometers by 9 kilometers, but you're talking about the memory footprint. So the high-res geometry takes up most of the memory, but it's the low-res imposters that stay in the global resident memory and enable us to draw the city out to the horizon. There were a lot of challenges there, so we have to be able to decimate the buildings, but also maintain the silhouette. The most important thing about that system is maintaining the silhouette of the building, right? I don't care so much about what's going on inside the face of a building, right? The flat. We're also, I would say, we're very fortunate. Buildings are basically boxes. So boxes are easy to optimize. If these were much more organic shapes, we would have had a whole different set of problems to deal with. But because we're essentially, in at least 90% of the cases, we're dealing with a box, right? We can get rid of a lot of the interior detail, we can preserve the silhouette, and then we can snap textures of each side of the building to reproject the look for each building from an atlas that it gets baked into. So those are some of the challenges in the case of Spider-Man games. But it's also, in addition to that being a challenge, there's also a flip side of that, which is because of the nature of a city that's basically rectangular boxes, we can do an awful lot of cheats. And come on down and pick up some swag.
Hello. Here.
Yeah.
So it was great hearing about the optimization techniques that were used in Spider-Man. So I recently came across a video talking about how parallax mapping was used for Windows. So could you give an idea about how that works?
Sure. So I did not write the parallax system myself, but basically the idea is that you generate a depth map of the interior of the space, and then using some fancy shader math, you use that depth map to create the illusion of parallax at runtime. So you do have to construct the interior as a 3D environment at some point, right? We bring that into Houdini, we set up a camera that looks into that room, we render a depth map and we render a color map. The depth map and the color map go into a special material graph, and the material graph handles the parallax occlusion at runtime. I wasn't very involved in that, so I can't go into a lot of detail, but there has been a fair number of like GDC presentations on parallax occlusion. But the crux of it is that you do need a depth map in order to pull it off. And please come on down and grab something. Sure. So we're out of time. I'll be hanging out, I guess, for a little bit. And there's plenty of swag here, so I guess anybody who wants can come up and grab some of this stuff. I really don't want to take it home. So thank you for coming, everyone.
Come on, ladies and gentlemen, let's give up a big round of applause. That was a phenomenal insight on procedural systems and tech behind Marvel's Spider-Man. A huge thank you to you, X-Ray. Thank you once again for your wonderful insights to all of us right here. Thank you once again. All right, ladies and gentlemen, quickly updating you all. We now have a quick short break. We're now going to take a short lunch break. Well, we'll see you all at sharp 2 p.m. right here as we will be kickstarting with our next set of sessions. Get ready to know sessions on AI in games while we return at 2 p.m. right here. I repeat, ladies and gentlemen, we're now going to have a quick short break. We request you all to please go ahead, grab some lunch, network with your fellow attendees. Join us back at 2 p.m. as we're going to be having our exciting sessions resuming. Well, the sessions are going to be AI in games while we return right here at sharp 2 p.m. for all of you. Thank you.